drove past his begging dead mother. What the black maid at the shelter revealed made him hunt his cousin down. Chapter 1. The discovery, the morning Caleb Samson almost destroyed everything he had built, began like every other morning of the last 15 years. His alarm didn't go off at 6. It never needed to. His body had learned long ago to wake before the world demanded anything of him, a habit carved into him by years of early conference calls, international flights to cities still dark when he landed, and the particular loneliness of being the kind of man who had more money than sleep. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse on the 43rd floor and looked down at the city, the way a general might survey a battlefield he had already won. Hargrove City stretched out below him in the gray pre-dawn, a maze of steel and glass and blinking lights, of delivery trucks and street sweepers, and the occasional solitary jogger who believed, as Caleb once had, that getting somewhere early meant something. He was 44 years old. He had built Samson Capital from a single office above a laundromat on Fifth and Monroe into one of the most recognized private equity firms on the eastern seaboard. He owned 4 properties, 2 of which he had never slept in. He had been featured on the cover of 3 financial magazines in the last 2 years alone. He drove a car that cost more than most people's houses and wore a watch whose price tag could fund a small classroom for a decade. By every measurable standard, Caleb Samson had made it. What he had not made, what he had quietly, systematically, and deliberately unmade over 25 years, was any version of the life he had come from. He didn't think about Millbrook anymore. He didn't think about the 2-bedroom house with the peeling porch steps and the garden his mother tended on her knees every Saturday morning. He didn't think about Grace Samson and her low, humming voice, and the way she used to pack his lunch with a folded note inside always the same 7 words. Do good today. I'm proud of you. He told himself he had moved on. He told himself that was what adults did, they built new lives and let old ones go. What he could never tell himself, in the honest darkness of 3 a.m. when the city was quiet and the penthouse felt less like a triumph and more like an exile, was that he had not moved on. He had run. His driver, Marcus, was waiting at the curb at 7:15 sharp. The way Marcus always was, quiet, professional, the engine already warm. Caleb slid into the back seat without looking up from his phone, already deep in an email chain about a merger he was closing before Thursday. The city moved past the tinted windows like a film he wasn't watching. They were 3 blocks from Samson Capital's downtown tower when the light at Hargrove and Ninth turned red. Marcus eased the car to a stop behind a delivery van. Caleb didn't look up. He was mid-sentence, thumbs moving fast across his screen, composing a reply that would determine the direction of a $40 million deal. What made him look up, he would never be able to fully explain. Not then, not later, not even to himself. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a movement. It was something closer to gravity, a pull he didn't choose and couldn't resist, as though something in the air had changed frequencies and his body registered it before his mind did. He looked to his left. She was standing on the median strip between Ninth and Hargrove, that narrow island of cracked concrete where the city had long ago stopped bothering to plant anything. She was old. That was his first thought, a thin, elderly woman in a gray coat that was too large for her, the collar turned up against the October wind. She held a piece of cardboard in both hands, the writing on it blurred from where Caleb sat. Her white hair was loose around her face, uncombed, catching the wind in slow, heavy waves. He almost looked away, and then she turned, not toward his car specifically, not toward him. She simply shifted, adjusting the cardboard sign, and her face came into the light, and every cell in Caleb Samson's body went completely and absolutely still. The phone dropped from his hand. He didn't hear it hit the seat. He didn't hear anything at all, because the face on that median strip, older, thinner, carved by years he hadn't witnessed, was a face he had last seen in a framed photograph at a funeral he had attended 5 years ago. A funeral for a woman who had died of a sudden illness. A woman whose house had burned 2 months later, destroying everything she had left behind. A woman whose death had been handled entirely by her nephew Caleb's cousin, Robert Aldine, while Caleb was in Singapore closing a deal he no longer remembered. A woman named Grace Samson, his mother, Marcus. His voice came out strange, flat and low, like something had been pressed out of it. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. "Sir, pull over. The light's about to pull over." Marcus pulled to the curb. The delivery van behind them honked once, then moved around. Caleb had the door open before the car had fully stopped, one foot on the pavement, his hand gripping the door frame like the world had tilted, and he needed something solid to hold. He stood on the sidewalk and stared across the 2 lanes of slow-moving morning traffic at the woman on the median. She hadn't seen him. She was looking at the cars moving in the other direction, holding her sign, her lips moving slightly, praying, he realized. She was praying. His mother used to pray every morning before she got out of bed, every single morning. He remembered the sound of it through the thin wall between their bedrooms, low and rhythmic and steady, like water running over stone. He crossed the street without thinking. A cab swerved. Someone yelled. He didn't slow down. He reached the median and stopped 3 feet from her, and she still hadn't looked at him. And he opened his mouth to say something, "Mom, Mother, Grace," and nothing came out. Nothing at all. Just air. She turned. And for one long, suspended second they looked at each other. Her eyes, deep brown, slightly clouded now with age, went wide. Her lips parted. The cardboard sign slipped from her fingers and hit the concrete, and she took one small step backward, and then she stopped, and she said barely above a whisper, "Caleb," the sound of his own name in her voice after 25 years, after a funeral, after everything. He couldn't speak. "You can't be here," she whispered, and there was something in her face that wasn't just shock, there was fear. Raw, cold, specific fear. "You can't." He said. "You wouldn't." She stopped herself. Her hand came up to her mouth. "Mom." The word finally came out of him, cracked down the middle. "Mom, I thought you were dead." Her eyes filled with tears. And then, before he could take another step toward her, she did the thing that would wake him up in cold sweats for months afterward. She flinched. She actually flinched away from him, like she was afraid of what he might do. And that told him, more than anything else could have, that something had been done to her. Something had been done to both of them. A traffic officer appeared from the corner, gesturing for Caleb to clear the median. Marcus materialized at his elbow. "Sir, let me help. Come this way," and within 60 seconds the practical machinery of wealth and assistance had moved both Caleb and his mother off the street and into the back of the car. His mother clutching her coat around herself like armor, Caleb rigid and silent beside her. His phone on the seat between them, the $40 million email still unfinished on the screen. He looked at her hands. They were raw from the cold. There was a small, poorly healed scar along her left forearm that he didn't recognize. She had lost weight, considerable weight, and the coat she wore had someone else's name written in the collar in permanent marker. The way clothes were marked at shelters. Shelters. She was living in a shelter. His mother, the woman who had worked 2 jobs for 17 years to make sure he had new shoes for school and a coat that fit, was living in a shelter and begging at intersections in October. And she had been buried 5 years ago. And she had flinched. He turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him. And there were 100 things in her eyes, love and grief and shame. And that fear, still present, still there. And Caleb Samson, who had not cried in front of another human being since he was 19 years old, felt something crack open in the center of his chest that he understood, even in that moment, would not be easily closed. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. She shook her head. "Not yet." Her voice was thin but steady. "Not here. There's a woman at the shelter, Mavis. She knows. She's been keeping the records. She'll tell you what I can't." "What does that mean?" "What can't you tell me?" She looked out the window at the city moving past. Her hands were folded in her lap, tight and still. "It means that some truths are too big to come from the person who lived them. You need someone else to say it first, so you know I'm not, so you don't think I'm." She stopped, swallowed. "He told you I was confused, didn't he?" "In the letters." Caleb went very still. "Robert told you," she said quietly, "that I had become confused, that I wasn't well, that I was saying things." He remembered. He had received 3 letters on Samson capital letterhead, because Robert had used the firm's address at the time, explaining that Grace was experiencing cognitive difficulties in the months before she died, that she had become erratic, that she had been saying things about the family, about money, that weren't grounded in reality. He had believed every word. He had believed every word, and he had kept sending money, larger and larger transfers, to the account Robert managed, and he had kept not coming home, and he had kept telling himself that Robert was handling it. Robert was there. Robert was family. He was very thorough, Grace Sampson said, still looking out the window. Her voice was perfectly calm, the way voices got when they had already exhausted the part of grief that was loud. I'll give him that. Outside, the city continued its ordinary morning. People walked to offices, to schools, to coffee shops. The world did not register that something had just shifted on its axis, that a man had reached across 5 years of manufactured death and touched the living hand of someone he had been told was gone. Caleb picked up his phone. He deleted the email about the merger. He would call Thursday's deal off and nobody would understand why, and he wouldn't explain it. He typed a single message to his assistant, Alina: clear everything. All of it. Indefinitely. Then he put his phone down and took his mother's raw, cold hand in both of his, and he didn't let go. Chapter 2. The deception uncovered. Mavis Okafor had worked at the Hargrove City Community Shelter on Clement Street for 11 years. She was a broad-shouldered woman of 60, with close-cropped silver hair, and the particular stillness that came from decades of witnessing other people's worst moments and absorbing them without breaking. She had been a social worker before the shelter. Before that, a nurse. She had 3 adult children and 7 grandchildren, and she brought jollof rice to the shelter on Fridays because she believed, firmly and without apology, that hot food was a form of dignity. She met Caleb Samson in the shelter's small administrative office on a Tuesday morning. She looked him up and down, once taking in the suit, the watch, the particular expression of a wealthy man encountering the reality of a place like this for the first time, and she did not seem impressed or intimidated by any of it. She gestured to the plastic chair across from her desk, and he sat. "Grace told me you'd come someday," Mavis said, settling into her own chair with the deliberate ease of a woman who had nowhere to be. "Didn't know when, but she was sure you'd come. How long has she been here?" Caleb asked. "On and off, 3 years. The first 2 after the fire she was at the Westside Mission. She came to us after that." Mavis folded her hands on the desk. "She never asked us to contact you." "Why not?" Mavis looked at him steadily. "Because she was afraid of what Robert Aldine might do if he found out she'd been found. He told her very clearly that if she ever contacted you or anyone in the family, the consequences would be worse than what he'd already done." A pause. "He also told her you knew." The air left the room. "He told her," Mavis continued, her voice even and precise, like she was reading from a document, "that you had been informed of her situation, that you had chosen not to intervene, that you had agreed." Those were the words she repeated to me, "that you had agreed it was better for everyone this way." Caleb stared at her. She believed that. Mavis's expression shifted not to judgment, but to something more complicated. "She believed it because you hadn't come, Mr. Samson. And because he showed her a letter." She opened her desk drawer and produced a plastic document sleeve. Inside it was a sheet of paper, business letterhead, a signature at the bottom. "She gave me this to keep safe 18 months ago. She found it in Robert's car during the fire years ago and hid it before he could take it back." Caleb took the sleeve with careful hands. He looked at the letter inside. It was on Samson capital letterhead. The signature at the bottom was a near-perfect imitation of his own. He read the letter once. Then he read it again. It was addressed to Robert Aldine and dated 3 weeks before his mother's alleged death. It expressed, in cold and formal language, his desire to have his mother's affairs resolved quietly and his trust in Robert to manage the transition with minimal disruption. It mentioned a transfer of funds to facilitate care arrangements. It closed with, "My time is not available for this. Handle it as you see fit." He had never written this letter. He had never seen this letter, but he recognized the letterhead, the specific font, the particular shade of gray in the Samson Capital logo, the layout of the address block, because it was the same letterhead his company had used between 2016 and 2019 before they rebranded. Robert had worked in Samson Capital's administrative department for 6 months in 2018. Caleb set the document sleeve on the desk with extreme care. "The way you set down something you might otherwise put through a wall. Tell me everything you know," he said. Mavis told him. What she knew was enough. What she knew, combined with what Caleb's investigation would uncover in the weeks that followed, assembled itself into a picture so deliberate and so cold that Caleb found himself, more than once, sitting in his office at 2 in the morning staring at the evidence boards his investigator had assembled, simply unable to reconcile the image of the cousin he had grown up with, the cousin who had come to his college graduation, who had been his best man at a wedding that ended before it began, who had sent flowers and a handwritten note when Caleb's first major deal closed, with the architecture of what had been done. The first thread was the hospital. Caleb had been told, in Robert's communications, that Grace had been diagnosed with a serious cardiac condition in early 2019 and had declined rapidly over 8 months. The hospital named in those communications was Millbrook Regional Medical Center, the same hospital where Caleb himself had been born. There were no records. Not of an admission, not of a diagnosis, not of a physician, not of a single visit. The name of the attending physician cited in Robert's letters, a Dr. Philip Caro, had surrendered his medical license in 2017 following a fraud investigation. He was currently working as a property manager in Nevada and had, when Caleb's investigator located him, turned ash-white at the mention of Robert Aldine's name and declined to comment until his own lawyer was present. Dr. Caro's lawyer ultimately negotiated his cooperation. Dr. Caro had, for a payment of $12,000, produced a death certificate for Grace Elaine Samson in November 2019. He had never examined her. He had never met her. He had received a notarized consent form later determined to be forged and a physical description, and he had produced the paperwork in exchange for the money and the understanding that the deceased was, in Robert's words, not going to make trouble. The second thread was the fire. Grace Samson's house, the house Caleb had grown up in, the house his mother had lived in for 31 years, burned to the ground in January 2020, 6 weeks after her alleged death. The official report cited faulty wiring. The house had been insured in Grace's name, and the beneficiary on the policy, updated 3 months before the fire, was Robert Aldine. Caleb's investigator, a former forensic accountant named Samuel Price, who had the manner of a bored accountant and the tenacity of a hunting dog, pulled the original fire report and had it reviewed by an independent arson analyst. The analysis was not ambiguous. The fire had originated in 2 separate locations simultaneously, the kitchen and the utility room, with an accelerant pattern consistent with deliberate ignition. The faulty wiring narrative required the original investigator to have missed or ignored significant physical evidence. There was nothing in the insurance payout trail to suggest any challenge to the report, because by the time the insurance money was processed, Robert Aldine had already moved it through 2 intermediate accounts and invested the majority in a real estate venture in his own name. And the remains. Caleb had been told there were remains recovered from the fire, that his mother's body had been cremated and the ashes scattered per her supposed wishes. At a location in the mountains she had loved, Robert had handled all of it. Caleb had been in Tokyo. He had wired money for the arrangements and sent a brief, terrible email of condolence and told himself he would process the grief properly when things slowed down. Things had never slowed down. There were no remains. The fire report noted no human remains at the scene. The cremation paperwork, which Samuel located through a funeral home in Millbrook that had since closed, listed a cremation with no physical remains provided, the paperwork noting only previously arranged disposition. The funeral home director, now retired and living in Florida, remembered the transaction and remembered finding it unusual, but had been paid in cash and had told himself it wasn't his business. Samuel laid all of this out for Caleb on a Thursday evening in late October, spreading documents across Caleb's conference table with the methodical precision of a man who had done this before. When he was finished, he stood back and let Caleb look. He needed her gone, Samuel said quietly. Not dead gone. A body creates questions, especially if someone decides to look closer later. No body, and the death certificate does the work. The fire was partly to destroy anything she might have left that could prove she was still alive, and partly for the insurance money. How much? The house policy paid $240,000. There was also a life insurance policy, small, about $50,000, that Grace had taken out years ago. Robert had himself listed as the beneficiary 2 months before the supposed death. Samuel paused. There's also the matter of the trust. Caleb looked up. Your grandfather established a modest family trust in 1987, Samuel said. Not large by your current standards, property holdings, some invested assets, current value around $800,000. Your mother was the named administrator. Upon her death, her role and her share transferred to the nearest named relative. Samuel met Caleb's eyes. Robert Aldine. Caleb sat very still. He was going to inherit a share anyway, Samuel continued. But not control of the trust. Not until Grace was gone. He gathered a few of the documents into a neat stack. Everything: the forged certificate, the fire, the insurance fraud, the trust manipulation, the fake letter. It was a single coordinated plan, executed over roughly 18 months. He was careful, but not as careful as he thought he was. Where is he now? Caleb asked. Same house in Millbrook. Still operating a small property management business. Has a lawyer he uses for everything. Samuel paused. He doesn't know that Grace is alive and that you found her. I've been careful about that. Caleb nodded slowly. He looked at the documents spread across his conference table, the forged letter in his own hand, the fraudulent death certificate, the arson analysis, the insurance trail, the trust manipulation paperwork, and he felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anything he had a clean word for. It was the feeling of understanding, finally and completely, the shape of the cage he had been living in for 5 years. The cage that had kept him from his mother. The cage that had been built by someone who sat at his table at Thanksgiving and called him cousin and smiled. He thought about Grace on that median strip in the October wind. He thought about a letter that said, "Handle it as you see fit." He thought about 25 years of silence and distance, and the particular cruelty of being told that your mother was confused, that she was saying things, that she wasn't well when she had been fine. She had been right. She had been trying to reach him through walls that Robert had built with forged documents and manufactured distances. Keep gathering, Caleb said. His voice was quiet and completely controlled. I want everything airtight before we move. Every document certified, every source on record, every financial trail traced to its end. He stood up from his chair. And Samuel, nobody touches Robert until I say so. I want him to have one more conversation with me. In the weeks that followed, while Samuel built the legal case with the help of the district attorney's office, which, when presented with Samuel's initial findings, had taken precisely 48 hours to open a formal investigation, Caleb spent his evenings at the shelter on Clement Street. Not in the administrative offices. Not in any official capacity. He sat in the common room with Mavis and with his mother, and he started the painstaking, uncomfortable, necessary work of being a son. It was not easy. It was not anything like the reunion he might have imagined. There was no clean emotional resolution, no moment where everything snapped back into place. There were silences that stretched too long, and conversations that kept hitting walls built out of decades of absence. There were evenings when Grace would look at him with an expression he couldn't read, and he would realize he didn't know her well enough anymore to read her expressions, and that was a grief all its own. But there were also other evenings. Evenings when she told him things he had never known about his father, who had left when Caleb was 3. About the years she had worked the second job so he wouldn't know how close they came to losing the house. About the notes she had kept putting in his lunch every single day, even after he was old enough to be embarrassed by them, because "do good today" was the truest thing she knew to say to him. He learned that she had been trying to reach him for months before Robert cut her off entirely, that she had called the office 3 times, that a receptionist had taken messages that never reached him, that she had written 2 letters that were never delivered. He learned that on the night Robert came to tell her what was going to happen, what he had arranged, what she was going to do, she had been calm. That she had understood, with the clarity that came from decades of hard living, that there was no winning that fight directly, that the only thing she could do was survive and wait and pray that one day her son would drive past the right intersection. Mavis, who was present for most of these evenings, said very little. She made tea. She occasionally offered the dry, precise observations of a woman who had watched a great many human dramas from a professional distance. Once, when Caleb and Grace had reached a silence that felt like it might break something, Mavis said simply, "You're both still here. That's where you start." It was, Caleb thought, the most useful thing anyone had said to him in years. Chapter 3. The reunion and confrontation the day Caleb brought his mother out of the shelter for the first time since she had arrived 3 years ago. It rained. Not dramatically. Not in the way that weather marks moments in films. It was a gray, steady November rain that made the streets shine and turned everyone's umbrellas into a slow-moving flower garden of blacks and greens and the occasional bright red. Caleb had arranged a car, not his usual one, not the luxury sedan, just a regular car with a regular driver, because his mother had said quietly that she found the other one uncomfortable, and they drove to a diner on Hadley Street that Mavis had recommended. It was the kind of place that had been there for 40 years and looked exactly like it. Vinyl booths, laminated menus, coffee that arrived without you asking for it, a cook in the back who called everyone hun. Grace looked around when they walked in, and something in her face relaxed the careful, composed expression she wore at the shelter, the expression Caleb was slowly learning to recognize as her version of armor, softened at the edges. They sat across from each other in a booth by the window and watched the rain move down the glass. "I used to bring you to a place like this," she said. "When you were maybe 9, 10, every other Saturday. You'd order the same thing every time." A small smile at the corner of her mouth, pancakes with extra syrup and orange juice. "And then you'd steal half my bacon. I remember that," Caleb said. And he did, a sudden clear image of yellow vinyl and the sound of a griddle and his mother cutting her pancakes into small, even squares while he demolished his own in approximately 4 minutes. Sullivan's, on Bream Street, gone now, years ago. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "A lot of things are gone." There was a silence that was both painful and strangely comfortable, the particular silence of two people who are beginning to find each other again in the ruins of a relationship they had both, in their separate ways, been trying to preserve. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said. "And I need you to hear it, even if it takes time to believe." She looked at him. "I didn't write that letter," he said. "The one Robert showed you. I need you to know that before anything else. I never wrote those words. I never agreed to anything. I never." He stopped, steadied himself. "I sent money because I thought that was what I could offer. I know now that's not what was needed, but I never." His voice dropped. "I never wanted you gone from my life. I want you to know that." Grace Samson looked at her son for a long moment. The rain moved down the glass. "The cook said *Han to someone at the counter. I know," she said quietly. "In my heart I always knew, but hearts need to be told sometimes." She set her mug down. "I know, Caleb." Something in his chest that had been clenched since the morning on the median strip loosened, not all the way, not permanently, but enough. They talked for 3 hours. The coffee was refilled 4 times. The cook sent out a plate of biscuits they hadn't ordered, and Grace accepted them with a Grace small g lowercase, the actual quality that Caleb watched and felt ashamed of his own years of coldness in comparison. She told him about the night Robert came. How he had arrived at the house with a folder of documents and a tone of absolute certainty, the way some people communicate that resistance is not a realistic option. How he had told her that Caleb had agreed, waving the forged letter like evidence that she would be better cared for in a facility, that the house would need to be sold to cover costs, that she should not contact Caleb because it would upset the arrangement. How he had given her $300 in cash and told her she had a week to collect what she could carry. She had not gone to a facility. She had gone to the West Side Mission because she had volunteered there for 6 years in the 1990s and still knew the director. She had survived. She had been careful. She had kept the letter she found in Robert's car, and she had kept her silence, and she had prayed every morning before she got out of bed. "Do good today. I'm proud of you." Caleb drove to Millbrook on a Tuesday morning, alone. He had told Samuel where he was going. Samuel had told him this was inadvisable, and that anything Robert said in an unrecorded, unwitnessed confrontation would be legally useless. Caleb had told Samuel he understood, and he was going anyway. Robert Aldine lived in a house on the quieter side of Millbrook, a well-maintained craftsman, with a wooden porch and a neat yard and window boxes that were empty now for autumn. He was 51 years old, heavy through the shoulders, with the kind of unhurried manner that came from never having had reason to hurry. He drove a good car, not extravagant, but good. He had a property management business that was, Caleb now knew, built largely on the insurance and trust money he had stolen from Grace. He answered the door in a flannel shirt, coffee mug in hand, and when he saw Caleb standing on his porch, his face went through three expressions in rapid sequence: surprise, calculation, recovery. Caleb. His voice was easy, warm, almost convincing. "Man, it's been a while. I've been meaning to call. Come in, come in." Caleb did not move from the porch. "I found her," he said. Robert's face went still. "I found her on 9th and Hargrove," Caleb continued, "standing on a median strip in October with a cardboard sign. She has a scar on her arm I'd never seen before, and she flinches when people move too fast near her, and she's been sleeping in a shelter." His voice was quiet, calm, the particular calm of a man who has already decided what comes next and is simply completing a required step. "She gave Mavis Okafor a letter for safekeeping 18 months ago. A letter you apparently forgot she'd taken from your car." The coffee mug in Robert's hand lowered very slightly. "I also have," Caleb said, "hospital records, or rather, the absence of them. A fire analysis that directly contradicts the official report. Financial records showing the insurance and trust money movement. And a former doctor named Philip Caro who has already made a formal statement to the district attorney's office." He paused. "You had yourself listed as the beneficiary on the life insurance policy before you filed the death certificate. That's a detail that tends to read a certain way to investigators." Robert opened his mouth. "Don't." Caleb's voice didn't rise. "It didn't need to. I'm not here for an explanation. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm not here because I want to understand why you did it. I already know why. You did it for money, and because you could, and because you calculated correctly that I was too distant and too absent to notice or fight back." He met Robert's eyes directly. "I'm here because my mother deserved to have someone stand on this porch and say to your face that we know. The truth is out, Robert. All of it." Robert stood in his doorway and said nothing. His expression had gone through the calculation and come out the other side into something flat and cornered and stripped of its ease. "You should call your lawyer," Caleb said. "Today." He turned and walked back to his car. He did not look back. Driving out of Millbrook on the highway that ran north toward Hargrove City, Caleb passed the exit for Bream Street where Sullivan's Diner had been 40 years ago, and he thought about a 9-year-old boy stealing his mother's bacon and his mother cutting her pancakes into small, even squares, and not minding, or minding and not showing it, which was the same thing really. He thought about Do Good today. "I'm proud of you." He pulled over onto the highway shoulder, put the car in park, and sat there for a while. The cars moved past him in both directions. The November sky was a clean, cold blue. Somewhere behind him, Robert Aldine was calling his lawyer. Somewhere ahead of him, in a shelter on Clement Street, Mavis Okafor was probably making tea, and his mother was probably praying, and the slow, difficult work of repair was waiting for him, patient as it had always been patient, ready to begin whenever he was ready to begin. He was ready. He put the car back in drive and headed toward the city. Chapter 4. Justice and Redemption. Grace Samson gave her formal statement to the district attorney's office on a Wednesday in late November. Caleb had offered to sit beside her. She had told him, gently but firmly, that she would prefer to do it on her own. "I've been carrying this a long time," she said, with the particular dignity of a woman who knew precisely what she had endured and had no intention of diminishing it by needing a hand to hold while she described it. "I can carry it to the end." She sat in a conference room on the 6th floor of the Hargrove County Courthouse for 4.5 hours. She had Mavis's documented records, the notes Mavis had kept over 3 years, the dates of Grace's arrivals and departures at the shelter, the names of other shelter staff who had interacted with her, the preserved letter in its document sleeve, and she had her own memory, which was sharp and detailed and entirely consistent with everything Samuel Price's investigation had uncovered. She told them about the night Robert came with the folder, about the forged letter, about being displaced from her home of 31 years with $300 in cash, about the fire, which she had not witnessed directly but had been told about by Robert himself, in a phone call 3 weeks later that she now understood had been a warning disguised as information, about the 3 years of careful, fearful silence, about Mavis, about the letter she had found in his car on a day she had gone back to the property for her Bible and found Robert's car unlocked in the driveway, and had looked inside without fully knowing why. The assistant district attorney, a woman named Catherine Marsh who had been in the office for 12 years and had a reputation for methodical, thorough prosecution, listened to all of it without interrupting once. When Grace was finished, Marsh closed her notebook and said, "Mrs. Samson, I want you to know that what you've described is one of the most comprehensive cases of deliberate fraud and premeditated abuse against a family member that this office has handled. We're going to make sure it's treated with the seriousness it deserves." Grace nodded once, precise and composed. "Thank you," she said. "And then, can I go now? I promised Mavis I'd be back for dinner." Robert Aldine was arrested on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later. The charges were significant: first-degree forgery, financial fraud, insurance fraud, arson in the first degree, and attempted murder, the attempted murder charge relating specifically to the displacement of a 67-year-old woman from her home in winter, in circumstances the prosecution argued constituted a deliberate attempt to end her life through exposure and destitution. His lawyer challenged several charges. The arson analysis held up under scrutiny. Dr. Philip Caro's testimony, delivered in exchange for immunity and under strict conditions, confirmed the fabricated death certificate. The financial trails Samuel had documented meticulous and comprehensive left little room for alternative interpretations. The trial lasted 9 days. Robert Aldine was convicted on all primary counts: forgery, financial fraud, insurance fraud, and arson. The attempted murder charge was reduced on appeal to criminal endangerment, a reduction that the prosecution accepted in exchange for a longer sentence on the arson conviction. He was sentenced to 14 years. Caleb was not in the courtroom for the verdict. He had chosen, deliberately, to be somewhere else. He was at the shelter on Clement Street, sitting in the common room with his mother and Mavis, eating Mavis's jollof rice. It was a Friday, and watching the afternoon come through the windows in long, slow bars of gold. Mavis had set 3 plates at the table in the corner she preferred, the one by the radiator, and she had poured the rice with the exactness of a woman for whom food was a form of precise love, and she had said grace quickly, quietly, in the low voice she used for it, and then they had eaten without talking much, the way people eat when they are comfortable enough with each other to not need the noise. Samuel called Caleb's phone halfway through the meal. Caleb looked at the screen, read the single word Samuel had texted "convicted," and set his phone face down on the table. His mother looked at him. "Convicted," he said. Grace Samson was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her fork and continued eating. Mavis nodded once slowly, the way she nodded when things were as they should be. They finished dinner. The Presence Foundation was established in January, 3 months after Caleb found his mother on a median strip in the rain, with an initial endowment of $8 million from Caleb's personal funds, and a mission statement that had taken him and Grace and Mavis 4 evenings, and a considerable amount of debate to finalize. The statement read in its final form: "The Presence Foundation exists to close the distance between people who love each other and the obligations, assumptions, and failures of attention that grow between them. We believe that presence, not provision, is the foundation of family. Our work supports family reunification, elder protection, shelter programming, and community-based care. We are here because someone was present when it mattered. We want to make that possible for everyone." The launch event was held at the shelter on Clement Street. Caleb had offered a hotel ballroom or a hired event space. Grace had said the shelter was where this story lived, and that was where it should be told. Mavis had said nothing, but had made 3 times the usual amount of jollof rice. There were roughly 70 people in the room, shelter staff and residents, a handful of press, representatives from the district attorney's office, Samuel Price standing in the back looking professionally unmoved, and a collection of community members who had heard about the foundation and come to see what it was. Caleb stood at the front of the room beside his mother, who was wearing a blue dress she had gone shopping for with Caleb the previous weekend, an expedition that had been its own complicated and tender and occasionally funny experience. And he held a single index card with notes he didn't need and spoke for about 8 minutes. He talked about what he had built and what he had lost in the building of it. He talked about the particular blindness of success the way achievement could create, if you weren't careful, a version of life so full of motion that it mistook movement for presence and money for love. He talked about sending checks to a house he hadn't visited in 6 years and telling himself that was the same as being there. He talked about a median strip on a rainy October morning. He talked about a woman who had kept records in a shelter office because she understood that truth needed witnesses, and about an investigator who had followed financial trails through 3 states because justice required documentation, and about a mother who had sat in a courthouse for 4.5 hours and told the whole story with precision and dignity because she believed it was worth telling. "I spent 25 years," he said, "building something I thought was a legacy. I was wrong about what legacy means. Legacy is not what you leave behind after you're gone. It's what you're present for while you're here." He paused. "I almost didn't have the chance to learn that. I almost drove past the intersection." Another pause and his voice dropped slightly. "I didn't. I'm grateful every day that I didn't." He looked at his mother, standing beside him in her blue dress, and she looked back at him the way she had looked at him across a vinyl booth in a rain-slicked diner, with the particular expression of a woman who had survived a very long time in a very hard silence and had come out the other side of it still capable of love, which was the most remarkable thing Caleb had ever witnessed. "The notes she used to put in my lunch," he said the same thing every day. 7 words. He paused. "Do good today. I'm proud of you." He looked at the room. "That's the whole thing. That's what the foundation is built on. That's what I should have been building all along." After the event, when the press had left and most of the guests had gone and Mavis was supervising the cleanup with the satisfied efficiency of a woman who had single-handedly organized 1,000 such evenings, Caleb and Grace sat on the steps outside the shelter in the January cold and looked at the street. The street was ordinary. A corner store on the opposite side, its lights bright in the early dark. A bus shelter with a torn advertisement. Someone walking a dog, the ordinary texture of a city evening, unremarkable and continuous and quietly alive. "What happens now?" Grace asked. It was the kind of question that could mean a dozen things. Caleb chose to answer the most important one. "I bought a house," he said, "on the north side. It has a garden." He glanced at her. "Needs work. The beds are completely gone. But the structure's good and the light is right. I thought if you wanted you might help me figure out what to plant." Grace Samson looked at her son for a long moment. "What kind of garden?" she asked. "Whatever kind you want." She was quiet, looking at the street. A small smile moved across her face, slow and real, the kind of smile that didn't perform anything for anyone. "I always liked dahlias," she said. "They're more work than people think, but the payoff is worth it." Caleb nodded. "Then dahlias." They sat on the steps for a while longer, the city moving around them, the cold pressing in from the edges and neither of them minding it much. Somewhere inside, Mavis was humming something low and rhythmic while she worked. The foundation sign, not large, not dramatic, simple dark letters on a light background, was visible through the shelter window, catching the interior light. "The Presence Foundation be here. That's enough. That's everything." Caleb thought about the 43 floors of glass and steel where he had stood that morning of the median strip and looked down at the city he had won. He thought about the particular emptiness of that view, beautiful and cold, and entirely without the thing that made beauty matter. He thought about 2 lanes of morning traffic and a woman with a cardboard sign, and the involuntary, inescapable, life-restoring force of recognition. He thought about what it meant to almost miss it, to almost keep the phone in your hand and never look up. And then he stopped thinking about what had almost happened and sat instead in what was actually happening. January cold, ordinary street, his mother beside him, the future alive and open, and asking nothing of him except that he stay. He stayed. The Presence Foundation, in its first year of operation, supported 11 family reunification cases, funded programming at 4 community shelters across Hargrove County, and established a legal aid clinic specializing in elder financial abuse, a service that, in its first 8 months, opened over 40 cases. Mavis accepted the position of Director of Community Programs at the Foundation. She continues to make jollof rice on Fridays. Robert Aldine began serving his sentence at Hargrove County Correctional in March. Grace Sampson's garden, planted the following spring, included dahlias in 4 colors. She was right about the payoff. Please subscribe, like, share, turn on notifications so you never miss a story. The ENDNEXT.